In a dimly lit, neglected corner of the city, where the forgotten streets whispered tales of lost hope and simmering resentment, a group of men, emboldened by their numbers and their deeply ingrained hatred, formed a circle around a solitary black woman in a wheelchair. To them, she appeared to be nothing more than an easy target, vulnerable, powerless, and isolated, as if she were just another victim to be preyed upon. But what these men failed to understand, what they could never have known, was that beneath the surface of their assumptions lay a truth so powerful, so dangerous, it would ultimately bring their entire operation crashing down around them. She wasn't just a woman in a wheelchair, a symbol of helplessness. No, she was far more than that. Ava James, a former Special Forces operative, was a strategist, a trained combatant, and a warrior with years of experience dismantling threats far more formidable than these hate-fueled individuals. Her career had been built on taking down enemies who thought they were beyond reach, enemies far more dangerous and sophisticated than a gang of misguided racists. What these men thought would be an easy confrontation was about to become their worst nightmare. By the time they realized their mistake, their network would be in ruins, their leaders exposed, and the terror that had long gripped this neighborhood would be replaced with a newfound sense of empowerment. But this isn't just the story of one woman standing her ground against hatred. It's the story of an unyielding force of justice, the resilience of the human spirit, and how a single determined act of courage can undo the very fabric of intolerance and cruelty. Ava's presence, calm and unwavering, would be the spark that ignited a fire of change, turning the tables on her attackers and showing them, in the harshest way possible, that the world would not bend to their bigotry. As Ava's custom titanium wheelchair hummed quietly, rolling over the cracked and uneven pavement, the night seemed unnaturally still, too quiet for a neighborhood like this one. The streetlights above flickered intermittently, casting long, jagged shadows that danced eerily across the walls, most of them covered with faded graffiti. The air felt heavy, saturated with the scent of rain that lingered just on the verge of falling but never quite made it. It was the kind of night that felt off, like the calm before a storm. Ava, ever alert, adjusted her gloves and tightened the strap of her bag, her instincts on edge. Years of training in the Special Forces had taught her to trust the silence, to recognize the smallest cues that something wasn't right. And tonight, everything about the stillness screamed trouble. She spotted the first man before he even fully emerged from the shadows. He stepped into view from behind a parked van, his tall, broad frame blocking her path. His bald head glistened under the flickering streetlight, and his stance was aggressive, deliberate, as if he were fully aware of the fear he intended to instill in her. He grinned, a cruel smirk curling at the edges of his lips as he took his time sizing her up. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "What do we have here? Out for a little midnight roll, are we?" Ava brought her wheelchair to a halt, her hands steady on the rims, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sized up the man. She could see the hate tattooed on his neck, the steel-toed boots, and the way his hand rested casually on his belt, where a weapon was surely concealed. Behind him, 3 other men emerged from the darkness, spreading out like a pack of wolves. One of them sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "You lost or something?" he taunted, his lanky form twisting as he circled her, eyes glinting with malice. A jagged scar ran down his cheek, marking him as someone who had lived through violence. "Maybe she's just sightseeing," another chimed in, his tone dripping with disdain. This man was stockier, his arms covered in crude, poorly inked tattoos. He chuckled darkly. "Doesn't seem like she sees streets like this where she's from." Ava's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Her gaze swept across the group, her mind working quickly as she assessed the threat. These weren't just random street thugs. They were organized. Every detail, from their boots to their tattoos, from the smugness in their grins to the way they carried themselves, told her this was more than just a chance encounter. These men were on a mission. They weren't just looking for a fight. They were looking to dominate. The leader of the group stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. He tilted his head mockingly, as if enjoying the power he had over her. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he jeered. "Or are you just too slow to keep up? Guess that's what happens when you let someone like you out in the wild." He sneered as he took another step toward her, his words laced with venom. "I bet you think you're tough, don't you?" he continued. "Out here, rolling around like you own the place, like you have some right to be in our neighborhood." The lanky one laughed, his voice rising with excitement. "Yeah, like she's got the right to be here," he added, his tone full of contempt. The stocky man, arms crossed and eyes narrowing, joined in. "What's a girl like you even doing out here? Shouldn't you be somewhere safe, maybe begging for scraps or waiting for someone to feel sorry for you?" The leader let out a harsh laugh. "She thinks she's tough," he mocked, turning to his friends as though Ava wasn't even there. "Rolling around like she's better than us, like she has the right to be here. She doesn't belong here, not in our neighborhood, not with people like us." His voice rose in fury as he spat the words. "She should have known better than to show her face around here." Ava remained calm, her breathing steady as her hands gripped the armrests of her chair. She had heard worse, faced worse. These men had no idea who they were dealing with, but she wasn't going to let them provoke her. Their words didn't shake her. They were nothing but empty threats from small-minded men who would soon learn that they had made a grave mistake. For a moment, the gang found themselves caught off guard by Ava's composure. The leader's initial sneer faltered for the briefest of moments, while the scarred man muttered under his breath, "She's got guts." His voice dripped with disbelief, but it wasn't a compliment. "Stupid," he added, his eyes narrowing. "But gutsy." "No, not guts," the leader corrected him, his expression tightening as he took a step closer to Ava. "Just too dumb to know when she's beat. Typical," he added, as though trying to convince himself that he wasn't the one losing control of the situation. Ava's sharp, calculating eyes flicked over their faces, memorizing every detail. She didn't need to respond to their taunts. She didn't need to justify herself. The only thing she needed was time. Time to plan her next move. Time to strike when the moment was right. The stocky man sneered, clearly irritated by her silence. "You think this is a game?" he spat, his voice thick with disdain. "You think your attitude is going to save you?" The lanky one circled her again, his cruel grin widening as he taunted, "Maybe we should teach her a lesson. Show her what happens when you roll where you don't belong." He laughed darkly, and the sound echoed ominously in the night air. "Yeah, she should know her place," the stocky man added, cracking his knuckles loudly. "Make sure she doesn't forget who's in charge around here." Ava remained unshaken, her face a mask of indifference. The leader stepped closer, his voice now low and menacing, as he tried to make his threat more palpable. "You've got two choices," he hissed, leaning in toward her. "Leave, or stay, and find out just how bad it can get." Ava's gaze remained steady, her pulse calm. Inside, though, a fire was burning brighter with each passing moment. These men thought they were predators, but in reality, they were nothing more than fools, playing a dangerous game. Ava had faced men like them before, men who believed strength was a matter of numbers and intimidation. They had no idea what was coming for them. Above her, the flickering streetlights cast uneven shadows across the cracked pavement, the dim light providing little comfort in the growing chill. The tension in the air was palpable, tightening like a noose around the group, and Ava's body remained still, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. The men had tightened their circle around her, a deliberate show of dominance, as they circled her like vultures. "You know," the lanky one began, his scarred face lit in the low light as he leaned in closer to Ava, "I've seen plenty of your type before." His words were slow, deliberate, dripping with mockery. "Always acting like you're so tough, like you're better than everyone else. But when push comes to shove, you're just like the rest, helpless." "Helpless?" the broad man echoed, his voice thick with ridicule. "Look at her. She's literally sitting down on the job." His laugh grated against Ava's ears, the kind of laugh that was designed to degrade, to strip her of her dignity. "She's not just helpless," the scarred man continued, a twisted grin spreading across his face. She's hopeless, sitting there, thinking she can outstare us like that's going to save her. Nah, she's already lost. Ava's eyes moved slowly between them, her expression unreadable, her calmness, her unshakable presence seemed only to enrage them further. "You think you're tough, don't you?" the leader sneered, crouching down to her level, his icy gaze locked onto hers, his lips curling into a cruel, twisted smile, sitting there like you've got nothing to fear. But let me tell you something. Fear is a good thing. Fear keeps people in line. And people like you should be terrified right now. The lanky man walked behind Ava's wheelchair, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his shadow falling across her like a predator's. "But she's not scared," he said, almost in awe. "Look at her, sitting there all high and mighty like she's above us." "Above us?" the broad man spat, his voice rising in a shout. "She's below us, in every way that matters. Physically, mentally, hell, even socially. She doesn't belong here, doesn't belong anywhere." The scarred man laughed bitterly, adding, "Probably one of those people who spends all day demanding respect without earning a shred of it." The leader straightened up, towering over Ava once more, his anger bubbling over. "Respect, huh?" he mocked, shaking his head. "That's a good one. You think you deserve respect?" He sneered at her, as if the very idea disgusted him. "Let me tell you how respect works. It's earned through power, through control, and right now, you've got neither." Ava tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but full of conviction when she finally spoke. "Is that what this is about? Power? Control?" She met the leader's gaze, unfazed by his intimidation. "Because from where I'm sitting, all I see are 4 insecure men trying way too hard to convince themselves they matter." Her words struck like a slap, leaving the leader's smirk faltering for the briefest moment. Rage flickered behind his eyes as he looked around at the others, but the spell was broken, the bravado cracking. For a brief second, they were no longer the confident bullies they imagined themselves to be. "You've got a real smart mouth," the leader growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "But that mouth isn't going to save you." "Not here." The broad man stepped closer, his boots scraping against the pavement with deliberate menace. "You keep talking like that, and you're going to regret it," he threatened. His words were venomous, laced with the kind of malice that had been building for far too long. "Oh, we've got plenty of ways to deal with people like you," the lanky one added with a sinister grin, stepping even closer. "But first, maybe we should take her down a peg. Show her what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The scarred man crouched beside Ava's wheelchair, his voice dropping to a whisper, his words chilling. "What's it like, sitting there, knowing you can't do a damn thing to stop us? Knowing you've already lost?" Ava's gaze shifted to meet his, her voice steady and unwavering. "What's it like?" she replied. "Knowing you're so desperate for power that you need to gang up on one woman to feel strong?" The scarred man's grin faltered, and he stood up abruptly, his jaw tightening in frustration. "You think you're funny?" he snarled, his patience slipping. "Keep talking. See where it gets you." Ava's calm, controlled demeanor seemed to push them even further. "Enough!" the leader snapped, raising his hand to silence the others. He leaned down again, his face inches from Ava's, his breath hot and heavy. "You think you're clever, don't you?" His voice was a low growl. "But clever doesn't mean a damn thing when you're outnumbered. You've got no backup, no way out. Just you and us." He straightened up, nodding to the broad man. "Grab the chair," he ordered. The broad man reached down, his meaty hand brushing against the armrest of Ava's wheelchair. Her body tensed, but she didn't move. Not yet. "See?" the lanky one chuckled, his voice full of smug satisfaction. "Not so tough now, are you? All that attitude? And for what? You're nothing. Less than nothing." The broad man gripped the armrest tighter, his fingers digging into the metal. "Just another?" "Enough!" Ava's voice cut through the air like a whip, sharp and commanding. The men froze, their laughter dying as they turned to stare at her, momentarily stunned by the force in her tone. Even the leader paused, his head tilting slightly in surprise, as Ava's cold, unflinching gaze moved between them. "You've been talking a lot about what I can't?" Ava's calm was unnerving. Despite the growing tension and the looming threat of violence, her eyes remained steady, her posture unflinching. The men had been talking down to her, underestimating her every move, but now they were beginning to realize that they were facing something far beyond their comprehension. For a moment, the silence that followed her challenge hung in the air, thick and oppressive, like a storm waiting to break. The leader, recovering first from the shock of her words, sneered, his lips curling into a twisted grin. "Big words for someone in your position," he scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let's see if you can back them up." He nodded once to the broad man, who immediately tightened his grip on Ava's wheelchair, his fingers digging into the metal with a force that would have intimidated anyone else. But not Ava. A cruel grin spread across the broad man's face as he prepared to show her just how powerless she was. "Let's find out how tough you really are," he said, voice full of anticipation. Ava's hands clenched tightly on the rims of her wheelchair. Her muscles coiled like a spring. She had waited for this moment, had calculated every step, and now the time had come to act. There was no turning back. The broad man, still grinning, lunged at her with all his weight, attempting to lift the back wheels of her chair off the ground and immobilize her. The sudden movement sent a jolt of urgency through Ava's body, but she was ready. Her fingers tightened around her baton, and in a swift motion, she twisted her torso and jabbed the baton backward with precision, striking his knuckles with a sharp crack. The man howled in pain, stumbling backward, dropping her chair. But before Ava could even take a breath, the lanky man darted in from her left, his long arms reaching for her baton. Ava's chair spun sharply to the right, the motor humming to life as she pivoted in a wide arc. The baton struck his wrist with a resounding thud, the impact sending a jolt up her arm, and his hand flew open. He cried out, clutching his arm, but Ava wasn't finished. With a flash of movement, she jabbed the baton into his ribs, forcing him back. He wheezed as the air was knocked out of him, stumbling backward to recover. But there was no rest for her attackers. The scarred man wasn't far behind. He had grabbed the heavy chain he had dropped earlier, and with a vicious arc, he swung it toward Ava's head. Ava ducked just in time, the chain whistling past her ear. Her heart pounded, but there was no time for hesitation. The moment he swung again, she was ready. With a brutal strike, she drove the baton into his knee, the sickening crunch of bone and muscle signaling that her aim had landed true. The man grunted in pain but stayed upright, his fury fueling his every move. He swung the chain again, this time aiming for her legs. The chain wrapped around one of her wheels, yanking it to the side. Ava's chair skidded slightly, but she didn't falter. Her mind was in motion, calculating her next move as she quickly twisted the motorized controls, spinning the chair sharply. The sudden movement dislodged the chain from the wheel, and Ava used the opening to strike upward. She jabbed the baton into the scarred man's chin, the force of the blow snapping his head back, and he staggered, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Lesson 2, Ava said coldly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Don't bring brute force to a battle of skill." The leader, who had been standing back, watching in disbelief, now advanced. His knife glinted in the dim light, and his earlier arrogance was replaced with cold fury. His eyes burned with the need to prove himself. "You think you've got this under control?" he snarled, the edge of his voice sharpening. "You're just in a fancy chair. You don't stand a chance." Ava's eyes flicked to him, and her grip on her baton tightened. "I've already beaten you," she said simply, her voice steady, unwavering. "You just don't know it yet." Without warning, the leader lunged forward, the knife slashing toward her midsection. Ava spun her chair, narrowly avoiding the blade. The leader followed up with another strike, faster this time, but Ava was ready. She parried the attack with her baton, the knife clanging against the steel, the sound echoing in the narrow alley. The leader's fury grew as he pressed the attack, slashing and stabbing with precision. But Ava was fluid in her movements, calculated in her defense. Each strike was blocked as she waited for her moment. It came when he overextended his arm, swinging the knife wide. Ava drove her baton into his wrist, forcing him to drop the blade. Without hesitation, she followed up with a strike to his shoulder, the impact knocking him off balance. The leader stumbled backward, but before Ava could finish him off, the broad man came charging in once more. He grabbed the side of her chair with a terrifying grip, his massive hands trying to tip it over. Ava braced herself, planting the baton against the ground to steady her chair. She twisted sharply, using the motorized controls to spin the chair and break his hold. The movement sent the broad man staggering, and Ava, seizing the opportunity, struck him in the back of the knee with the baton. He crumpled to the ground with a howl of pain, but Ava was already moving, anticipating the next wave of attacks. The lanky man, still stunned, shouted as he rushed toward her again, picking up a loose piece of wood from the ground. He swung it downwards, aiming for her head. Ava ducked, the wood splintering as it hit the back of her chair. Without missing a beat, she countered, striking him quickly in the shin before jabbing the baton into his ribs. The lanky man fell to the ground with a groan, but the fight wasn't over yet. The scarred man, blood dripping from his lip, was back on his feet, wielding the chain once more. He swung it with both hands, aiming low this time, trying to trip her up. The chain wrapped around the base of her chair, yanking it sideways. Ava's chair tilted dangerously, but she steadied herself, using her baton to strike the chain and loosen his grip. She spun her chair sharply, the motor's hum growing louder, and the chain slipped free. Ava drove her chair forward, ramming into the scarred man's stomach with the reinforced front panel. The impact sent him sprawling onto his back, gasping for breath. The leader, now weaponless but still dangerous, advanced again, his fists clenched in rage. He grabbed for her baton, but Ava was ready. She let him get close, then spun her chair to the side, using the movement to pull him off balance. She struck his thigh with the baton, and he dropped to one knee, cursing in frustration. "Surround her!" the leader roared, his frustration boiling over. "Now!" The men obeyed, spreading out to encircle her. The broad man picked up a discarded trash can lid, using it as a makeshift shield. The lanky man grabbed another piece of wood, while the scarred man, still holding the chain, moved to block her escape. Ava was surrounded, but she wasn't afraid. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about showing them what they had underestimated. The leader's fists were raised in front of him, his eyes locked on Ava with a fury that burned hotter with each passing second. "You're not getting out of this," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "We're ending this now." The gang's desperation was palpable. They were worn, exhausted, and hurt, but they had crossed a line, and now they wouldn't stop until they had shown Ava who was in charge. Ava, however, remained calm, her breath steady, her eyes darting between them as she assessed the situation. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of their desperation pressing down on her. They were cornered, but they were not giving up. Neither was she. The broad man was the first to charge. Gripping the trash can lid like a shield, he advanced toward her with a roar, his body weight pushing forward with alarming speed. Ava didn't flinch. She wheeled backward, waiting until the last moment before striking. Her baton collided with the edge of the lid with a loud clang, the impact sending a shock through her arms. The broad man pressed forward relentlessly, trying to force her against the wall, but Ava twisted her chair sharply to the side, the motor humming as she maneuvered. She drove the baton into his exposed side, hitting him with precise force. He grunted, dropping the lid as he staggered back. Before she could catch her breath, the lanky man followed, swinging a piece of wood wildly at her head. Ava deflected the blows with her baton, the wood splintering with each strike. Her hands were steady, her movements fluid, as she countered with a sharp jab to his wrist. He yelped, the weapon flying from his hands. Without wasting a second, Ava followed up with a strike to his knee. The lanky man collapsed to the ground, clutching his leg, but the battle was far from over. The scarred man, now enraged, swung his chain once again, the metal glinting in the dim light. The chain whistled through the air, aimed at Ava's head. She ducked just in time, the chain narrowly missing her ear. Spinning her chair to face him, she grabbed the chain mid-swing, yanking it from his hands. In one fluid motion, she struck him across the face with her baton. Blood spurted from his nose as he crumpled to the ground, but Ava wasn't finished. The leader, now the last man standing, hesitated. His eyes darted between Ava and his fallen comrades, the fear creeping into his features despite his best efforts to remain composed. In the distance, the faint sound of approaching sirens echoed, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights flickered at the end of the alley, a sign that help was on the way, but the leader wasn't ready to concede defeat. "This isn't over," he spat, backing away, his fist still clenched in defiance. "You got lucky tonight." Ava didn't lower her baton, her gaze cold and unyielding. "Next time, don't mistake my silence for weakness." The leader glared at her for a long moment, his rage palpable. Then, turning with a sharp motion, he disappeared into the shadows, the others scrambling to follow. The alley fell silent, save for the sound of Ava's steady breathing and the faint hum of her wheelchair's motor. For a moment, it seemed like the ordeal was over, but the leader hadn't gone far. His pride had been wounded, his anger too great to let him retreat entirely. His eyes glinted with malice as he gestured for the others to regroup. Despite their battered forms, the gang obeyed, their earlier bravado replaced with quiet desperation. They formed a semicircle around Ava, their need to reclaim the dominance she had so effortlessly stripped from them more evident than ever. They had failed once, but they weren't ready to walk away yet. "You're tougher than you look," the leader admitted, his voice sharp and venomous. He wiped blood from his lip, his glare unwavering. "But no one gets the better of us. No one!" The scarred man, chain still in hand, growled menacingly. "We're not letting her walk or roll out of here alive." Ava's fingers tightened on her baton. Her eyes darted between each of the attackers, calculating her next move. They weren't finished. Not yet. Her muscles ached from the constant movement, but she couldn't afford to let up. These men were like cornered animals, and desperation made them dangerous and unpredictable. She had to stay alert, stay focused. The broad man moved first, his anger propelling him forward despite the limp in his step. He had picked up the discarded trash can lid again, holding it like a shield as he charged toward her. Ava let him come, waiting until the very last moment before spinning her chair sharply to the side. The lid grazed her armrest as he barreled past, leaving his side exposed. Ava seized the opportunity, striking him across the ribs with her baton. He roared in pain, but before she could follow up, the lanky man closed in. "Not so fast," the lanky man snarled, grabbing for her baton with both hands. Ava's grip was unyielding as she twisted the baton free and slammed it into his forearm. He yelped, his grip loosening, but instead of retreating, he lunged forward, wrapping his arms around her chair in a desperate attempt to hold her still. The added weight slowed her movement, and she could feel the strain on the chair's motor as she tried to spin away. "Hold her!" the leader barked, rushing toward her with a knife he had retrieved from the ground. Ava's mind raced, the lanky man's grip tightening, but she didn't falter. She slammed the baton into his side repeatedly, each blow eliciting a grunt, but his desperation outweighed the pain. He held on, refusing to let go. The scarred man approached from the opposite side, the chain swinging loosely in his hand. "You're done now," he said, his voice filled with malice. With a powerful swing, he aimed the chain toward Ava's arm. She barely managed to block it with her baton, the impact reverberating through her arm. She didn't let go. The broad man, recovering from her earlier strike, approached from behind. His massive hands reached for the back of her chair. "Got you now," he growled. Before he could finish, Ava shifted her weight forward and hit the joystick to reverse. Suddenly, the back of her chair collided with his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered back, gasping for air, but the other two men still had her cornered. The leader advanced again, his knife gleaming under the flickering streetlight. "Let's see how smart that mouth of yours is without your fancy little stick," he growled, slashing downward. Ava met the blade with her baton with a sharp clang. The force of the blow pushed her arm back, but she gritted her teeth, using her other hand to spin the chair, breaking his line of attack. She jabbed the baton into his knee, causing him to stumble. But the scarred man was already swinging his chain again. It wrapped around her baton this time, and he pulled hard, trying to disarm her. Ava's grip didn't falter. She used the tension of the chain to yank him closer, slamming the reinforced front of her chair into his shin. He howled in pain, dropping the chain as he collapsed to the ground. The leader, now weaponless but still dangerous, lunged again, his knife slashing in rapid arcs. Ava's baton clanged repeatedly against the leader's knife as he relentlessly slashed toward her. Each strike reverberated in the alley, but her arm was growing tired. The gang's persistence was testing her limits, and she knew she couldn't keep this pace up forever. She needed an opening, a way to turn the tide once and for all. From the corner of her eye, she saw the young man who had called the police earlier. He stood frozen at the mouth of the alley, his phone still in his hand. Ava met his wide-eyed gaze briefly, and he nodded, raising the phone to his ear once more. "Where are they? They need to hurry!" he shouted into the phone, the desperation in his voice palpable. The faint wail of sirens grew louder in the distance, but they weren't close enough yet. The leader noticed the distraction, and his fury intensified. "You think the cops are going to save you?" He spat, his voice thick with venom. He slashed the knife toward Ava's arm. "They'll just clean up the mess when we're done." Ava blocked the strike, the baton vibrating in her hand from the impact. "Lesson 3, she said through gritted teeth. "Desperation makes you sloppy." With a twist of her chair, she moved sharply to the side, throwing off the leader's balance as he stumbled forward. In that instant, she delivered a powerful blow to his wrist, sending the knife flying from his hand. The leader howled in frustration, clutching his hand, but the broad man was already moving in from the side. The broad man grabbed a nearby metal pipe, swinging it with all his strength, aiming for Ava's wheels. The impact jarred her chair, forcing it to tilt dangerously. Ava fought to regain control, her fingers tightening on the joystick. She wheeled backward, narrowly avoiding another swing, and countered with a strike to his shoulder. The pipe clattered to the ground as the broad man fell to his knees, groaning. The lanky man, who had been circling behind her, lunged suddenly, grabbing the back of her chair and holding it in place. Ava twisted sharply, using the motorized power of her chair to pull free, but his grip was strong. The scarred man joined in, grabbing her arm in an attempt to pin her down. "You're not getting away this time," the lanky man shouted, his voice trembling with effort. Ava's breath came in sharp bursts as she fought against their combined strength. She drove her chair forward, slamming into the lanky man's knee and forcing him to let go. The scarred man tried to pull her baton away, but she twisted it free and struck him across the face with a brutal swing. He fell to the ground, blood pouring from his nose. The sound of approaching sirens grew deafening, their red and blue lights illuminating the alley in sharp bursts. The leader's face twisted with fury as he realized their time was running out. "Let's go!" he barked, his voice filled with venom. "We'll finish this another time." The men hesitated, their gazes flicking between Ava and the flashing lights. The leader cursed under his breath, then turned and retreated into the shadows, the others scrambling to follow. Ava didn't move, her baton still raised, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The young man approached cautiously, his phone still in hand. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ava nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I'm fine," she said, her tone even. "Thanks for the assist." Police cars screeched to a halt at the entrance of the alley, officers pouring out with weapons drawn. Ava exhaled slowly, the tension finally leaving her body. The fight was over, for now, but she knew it wouldn't be the last time. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the alley, their rhythmic pulses reflecting off the scattered debris. Ava remained steady in her wheelchair, the cold steel of her baton resting across her lap, her sharp eyes tracking every movement. Officers were gathering evidence, marking the bloodstains on the pavement, and documenting the array of crude weapons left behind by the fleeing gang. Despite the tension dissolving, Ava's mind remained on high alert. The young man who had called for help stood awkwardly nearby, his phone dangling in his hand. He stole glances at her every few moments, clearly grappling with what he had witnessed. "You're really not hurt?" he finally asked, his voice breaking the silence between them. Ava turned her gaze to him, her expression softening. "I'm fine. A few bruises. Nothing I can't handle." His lips twitched into a nervous smile. "You were amazing. I've never seen anyone fight like that." Ava gave a small nod, acknowledging his praise but keeping her focus. "What's your name?" "Marcus," he said quickly, as if eager to prove his usefulness. "I live around here." "Well, Marcus," Ava said, her voice steady, "you've got good instincts. If you hadn't called when you did, things might have gone differently." His face reddened slightly, but his eyes brightened at her words. I didn't know what else to do. Those guys, they're always around, you know? Not just here. I've seen them in other parts of the neighborhood, too. They mess with people. It's not the first time." Ava's fingers tightened slightly on her baton, her suspicions confirmed. "Tell me everything you've seen." Marcus glanced toward the group of officers, who were busy logging evidence and speaking into their radios. His voice dropped to a whisper. "They're part of some crew. I don't know their name, but they've been tagging walls for months. Hate symbols, slogans I don't understand. They show up in groups, pick fights, scare people." Ava leaned in slightly, her focus intensifying. "And no one's done anything about it." Marcus hesitated, then shrugged helplessly. "People are scared. Most of the time, they don't stay long enough to get caught. They jump someone, do their damage, and disappear. The cops come after, but nothing sticks." Ava nodded slowly, her mind working quickly. The attack was just the beginning. This gang wasn't just a few misguided men. They were part of something much bigger, something that needed to be stopped before more harm was done. Tonight had not been just another random act of violence. It was part of a much larger operation, a coordinated effort designed to intimidate and control. Ava knew that much. The gang's confidence, their swift and purposeful targeting of someone like her, was not the result of mere happenstance. It was part of a bigger puzzle, one she intended to solve. She straightened in her chair, her decision firm and resolute. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her community, for the countless others who had been forced into silence by fear. "Thank you, Marcus," she said softly, looking over at the young man who had helped her tonight. "You've been a big help, but now I need you to stay safe. These men won't take kindly to interference." Marcus frowned, his brow furrowed in concern. "But what about you? Are you okay?" Ava met his gaze, her tone unwavering. "I'm fine, but they're dangerous. If you need anything, just ask. I'll find you." He hesitated for a moment, clearly torn, but finally nodded. "I'll be careful," he said, glancing back toward the alley where the police were now converging. "Thanks again, Ava. Go home," she instructed. "Don't linger here. Get somewhere safe." Marcus lingered for another moment, but after meeting her gaze, he finally retreated down the street, glancing back once before disappearing around the corner. Ava turned her attention back to the police, who were now approaching her. The senior officer, his badge reading Sergeant Halstead, crouched slightly to meet her gaze. He was a seasoned officer, his sharp eyes studying her with a mix of suspicion and intrigue. "Ma'am," he began, his tone professional, yet tinged with curiosity. "We need to take your statement. Can you walk us through what happened here?" Ava gestured to the scattered evidence, broken weapons, bloodstains, and the remnants of the struggle. "They came out of nowhere," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos that had unfolded just moments before. "4 of them. They surrounded me, taunted me, then started making threats. When they tried to grab me, I defended myself." Halstead raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You defended yourself against 4 men?" A faint smile tugged at the corner of Ava's lips. "Years in the Special Forces teach you a thing or two," she replied. Halstead's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of respect crossing his features. "I see. And do you know who they were? Or why they targeted you?" Ava's jaw tightened, her mind still processing the events of the night. "I've got a good idea," she said, her voice steady but firm. "They weren't just random punks looking for trouble. They were deliberate, organized. Their tattoos alone tell me they're part of something bigger." Halstead nodded grimly, understanding. "We've seen their kind before. Hate groups. These guys have been popping up more and more lately. Problem is, they're hard to pin down. No one ever talks, and by the time we gather enough evidence, they've moved on. Ava's eyes narrowed, her frustration palpable. That's because no one's fighting them where it hurts. They're counting on fear to keep people quiet. Halstead studied her for a moment, his gaze searching, before sighing. Look, we do what we can. We've got their weapons, their blood on the ground, and your statement. It's a start. Ava shook her head, her determination unwavering. It's not enough. These men aren't just street thugs. They're part of a network. If you want to stop them, you'll need more than a few scattered arrests. Halstead's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that told her he understood. And you think you can help us with that? Ava's voice was unwavering, her confidence radiating from her. I know I can. Halstead hesitated for a moment, then nodded toward one of the younger officers standing nearby. Get her contact information. We'll be in touch. Ava provided them with her details, then watched as they wrapped up their investigation and loaded the evidence into their vehicles. The alley grew quieter as the flashing lights receded, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She wheeled herself to the edge of the alley, her eyes scanning the dark streets beyond. The fight had been just the beginning. The men who had attacked her tonight thought they could intimidate her, break her down, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Ava tightened the strap of her bag and adjusted her gloves. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The following morning, Ava sat in her small apartment, her laptop open in front of her, the faint hum of the city filtering through the window. She scrolled through online forums, news articles, and police reports, looking for patterns, incidents, symbols, anything that could point her toward the gang's larger operations. Her mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her concentration. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. It was from Sergeant Halstead. "This is Sergeant Halstead. We've got some preliminary intel on the gang. Meet me at the station at 2 p.m. Ava smirked. She hadn't expected Halstead to move so quickly, but she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. She grabbed her bag, adjusted her gloves, and headed out the door, her mind already planning her next move. At the station, Halstead greeted her in the lobby, leading her to a small conference room where a stack of files was waiting on the table. "This is everything we've got on them so far," he said, his tone serious. "It's not much, but it's a start." Ava flipped through the files, her sharp eyes scanning the mugshots, reports, and notes. The gang was part of a larger group operating across several neighborhoods. Their activities ranged from graffiti to violent assaults. Their targets were consistent: minorities and anyone who didn't fit their twisted worldview. "This isn't just a gang," Ava muttered under her breath. "It's an ideology. They're recruiting." Halstead nodded, a grim expression on his face. "That's what worries us. They're growing, and they're getting bolder. Last month, they attacked a local community center. No one was seriously hurt, but the message was clear." Ava's mind raced as she connected the dots. "They're escalating, testing boundaries to see how far they can go." Halstead leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. "So, what's your plan?" Ava met his gaze, her expression steely. "I'm going to find their leader and cut the head off the snake." Over the next week, Ava immersed herself in the hunt. With Halstead's help, she tracked down informants, combed through surveillance footage, and followed every lead. She spoke to victims, piecing together a clearer picture of the gang's operations and their hierarchy. The leader, a man known only as Rex, was elusive but ruthless. He orchestrated the attacks, spread propaganda, and recruited new members. Ava knew that taking him down wouldn't be easy, but she was determined. As she prepared for her next move, Ava reflected on the fight in the alley. It wasn't just about self-defense anymore. It was about justice. These men had terrorized her neighborhood for too long, and she wasn't going to let them win. She tightened her gloves and adjusted her chair. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Tracking the gang proved to be far more challenging than Ava and the police had initially anticipated. For every lead they uncovered, there seemed to be 2 more dead ends, as though the gang had carefully anticipated their every move. The gang was meticulous. Their movements were deliberate, and they operated in the shadows, using fake identities, burner phones, and coded language to cover their tracks. It was becoming apparent that these were not just some random thugs. They were part of a much larger, more sophisticated network. One evening, as Ava sat in her apartment, staring at the scattered evidence on her desk, frustration began to mount. Maps, photos, and notes were pinned to a corkboard, all interconnected with red string. She had traced the Black Iron Bar and the train yard. Both were confirmed hotspots for the gang's activities, but they didn't provide the answers she desperately needed. Each new piece of information only led to more questions, and Ava could feel the weight of the growing uncertainty. Her mind raced, but nothing was adding up. Her phone buzzed suddenly, snapping her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Marcus. His voice, when he called her, was hurried and filled with urgency. "Ava, I think I found something," he said quickly. "Meet me at the old hardware store on Holloway Street. And come quick." The hardware store was a relic of the past, a run-down structure with peeling paint and windows boarded up. It had long since been forgotten by the community. Ava wheeled herself into the alley behind the building, her instincts on high alert. She spotted Marcus waiting for her, a nervous energy radiating from him. He glanced around, making sure no one was watching, before approaching her. "What did you find?" Ava asked, her voice steady, though her curiosity was piqued. Marcus gestured toward the back door of the hardware store, his hand trembling slightly. "There's a guy in there, a former member of the gang. He's been laying low, but he knows things. I convinced him to talk." Ava arched an eyebrow, intrigued. "And he agreed, just like that?" Marcus hesitated, shifting nervously. "Not exactly. He, might have needed some convincing, but he's scared of Rex. Said he wants out." Ava's gaze sharpened. "All right, let's hear what he has to say." Inside, the room was dimly lit, a stale scent of mildew and desperation hanging in the air. A man in his late 20s sat on an overturned crate, his eyes darting nervously, as though he expected someone dangerous, to burst in at any moment. His hands trembled as he clutched a cup of coffee that Marcus must have brought him. "Name's Caleb," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't sign up for this, you know. At first, it was just a group, a bunch of guys sticking together. But Rex, he's something else." Ava crossed her arms, watching him closely. "What do you mean?" Caleb glanced toward the door, his eyes wide with fear. "He's connected, really connected. Everything we do, it's for someone higher up. He's got people paying him, supplying him. That's how we get the weapons, the trucks, everything." Ava leaned forward slightly, her voice firm. "Do you know where these supplies are coming from?" Caleb hesitated before nodding. "There's a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. They don't use it often, but when they do, it's big. I think they're planning something soon." That night, Ava and Officer Medina set up surveillance outside the warehouse Caleb had mentioned. The industrial district was eerily quiet, the streets dimly lit by flickering lamps. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its windows dark and uninviting. Hours passed with no activity. Ava's patience was wearing thin, and she was beginning to wonder if Caleb had sent them on a wild goose chase. But then, the sound of engines broke the silence. A convoy of black SUVs pulled into the lot, their headlights cutting through the dark. Men in tactical gear emerged from the vehicles, unloading crates and moving with practiced efficiency. Ava's sharp eyes caught the unmistakable glint of rifles through the open doors. "This is it," Medina whispered, snapping photos from their hidden vantage point. "But what are they doing here?" Ava frowned, narrowing her eyes as she observed the scene. "It's not just storage. Look at them. They're preparing for something." The two women watched in silence as the men worked quickly, unloading crates and setting up what appeared to be a command center inside the warehouse. Ava took careful note of their movements, but the presence of armed guards made it impossible to get any closer. The following day, Ava and Halstead reviewed the footage. The gang's activities at the warehouse were clearly part of a larger operation, but their exact plans remained unclear. "We need to know what's inside those crates," Halstead said, his frustration evident. "But getting a warrant without hard evidence is going to be impossible." Ava's mind raced, thinking of another possibility. What if we don't need a warrant? What if we intercept one of their deliveries? Halstead raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting we intercept armed criminals mid-transport? It's risky. Ava nodded, her expression unwavering. But it's our best shot at getting concrete evidence. 2 nights later, Ava tracked one of the gang's delivery trucks as it left the train yard. The route took it through a deserted stretch of road near the outskirts of town. Halstead and his team set up a makeshift roadblock, their unmarked vehicles blending into the shadows. When the truck approached, the officers sprang into action, surrounding the vehicle with weapons drawn. The driver and his passenger, a pair of burly gang members, were caught off guard, but didn't resist. Inside the truck, they found crates filled with assault rifles, ammunition, and explosives. "This is enough to level a building," Halstead muttered as he inspected the haul. "What the hell are they planning?" Ava's jaw tightened. "Whatever it is, we need to stop it." Despite the success of the interception, tracking down Rex and the gang's leadership proved difficult. The captured gang members refused to talk. Their loyalty to Rex was unshaken, even under pressure. Ava knew they needed more leverage. She decided to follow another lead, a known associate of Rex named Tyler, who worked at an auto shop on the edge of gang territory. Ava and Medina staked out the shop for days, watching Tyler's movements carefully. One evening, Tyler left the shop in a hurry, carrying a duffel bag. Ava followed him at a safe distance, her wheelchair equipped with a silent motor, moving steadily through the shadows. Tyler led her to a secluded meeting spot near the docks, where he handed the bag to another man. Ava snapped photos of the exchange, her eyes focused on the tattoos on the second man's neck. She knew this was important. Back at the precinct, Ava and Halstead pieced together the latest information. The man at the docks was identified as Viktor Orlov, a known arms dealer with ties to international criminal networks. "This isn't just a local gang," Ava said, her voice grim. "Rex is part of something much bigger." Halstead nodded grimly. "And if Orlov's involved, this goes way beyond just a few street thugs. Beyond hate crimes, what they were uncovering was far more sinister: organized crime and possibly even terrorism." With the discovery of Orlov's involvement, the task force's focus shifted. They began tracing financial transactions and shipments connected to his global network, hoping to uncover the full extent of the operation. The walls between the gang's seemingly random acts of violence and a more calculated, far-reaching plan were quickly starting to collapse. Ava continued her work on the ground, speaking to informants and tracking the gang's every move. Each piece of information she gathered brought her closer to understanding their plans. But the stakes were now higher than ever. This wasn't just a gang spreading hate. They were arming themselves for something catastrophic. As the pieces fell into place, Ava knew one thing for certain: this fight was far from over. Ava sat in her small apartment late into the night, her corkboard now almost completely covered with maps, photos, and notes. Red strings stretched between locations, people, and events, forming a tangled web that revealed just how deep this operation ran. The recent discovery of Viktor Orlov's involvement had shifted her focus entirely. This was no longer just about Rex's gang. It was about dismantling a much larger network of hate, crime, and terror. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Halstead. "We've got something," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Another shipment is moving tomorrow night. This time, they're using a truck registered to one of Orlov's shell companies. We think it's headed to a warehouse near the docks." Ava leaned forward, her mind racing. "Do we have enough for a warrant?" "Not yet," Halstead admitted. "But we're tailing it. If they lead us somewhere important, we might get what we need." "Good," Ava replied. "I'll meet you at the precinct in the morning." There was a brief pause before Halstead spoke again. "Ava, I know you're invested in this, but Orlov's people aren't like Rex's gang. They're professionals. If you're spotted—" "I know the risks," Ava interrupted, her voice firm. "But this is bigger than all of us. I'll see you tomorrow." The next evening, Ava joined Halstead and Officer Medina in an unmarked van, parked a few blocks from the train yard. They watched through binoculars as the gang loaded crates onto a large, nondescript truck. The operation was efficient, almost militaristic, and the men moved with the confidence of those who knew they wouldn't be stopped. "That's the same guy from the warehouse," Medina said, snapping photos of a burly man directing the loading, scars on his temple. "He's definitely a lieutenant." "And there's Rex," Ava added, her tone sharp. She pointed toward the shadows where the gang leader had emerged. His cold, calculating gaze swept the area, and he spoke briefly with the man in charge before climbing into a black SUV and driving off. Halstead gritted his teeth. He's too careful, always keeps himself one step removed. "Not for long," Ava muttered under her breath as the truck pulled out of the train yard. Halstead's team followed at a safe distance, with Ava's modified wheelchair secured in the back of the van. She remained alert, her mind working through possible scenarios. The truck led them through the industrial district and toward the docks, finally pulling into a fenced-off warehouse. Halstead parked a block away, and they watched as the gang unloaded the crates. Their movements were shadowy and deliberate. "Medina, get the drone up," Halstead ordered. Medina launched a small surveillance drone, guiding it over the warehouse. The live feed showed rows of crates stacked inside, along with armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Ava's sharp eyes caught sight of several men she recognized from her earlier reconnaissance. "This isn't just a storage site," Ava said quietly. "They're arming for something big." The next day, Ava pushed further into the network, using the evidence they had gathered. She contacted an old acquaintance from her Special Forces days, Dylan, a tech expert with a knack for uncovering hidden connections. They met in a quiet cafe, far from prying eyes. "This is heavy stuff," Dylan said, scrolling through the data on his laptop. "You're not just dealing with local thugs. Orlov's network spans multiple countries. Weapons trafficking, money laundering, even ties to extremist groups. If you take one piece out, the rest of the puzzle adjusts." "That's the goal," Ava replied, her voice firm. "We need to disrupt their supply chain, cut off their funding, and expose their leadership." Dylan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Orlov is the key. If you can prove he's directly involved, the entire network could crumble." "Rex?" he smirked. "He's just a cog in the machine. Dangerous, sure, but replaceable. Orlov is the one pulling the strings." Over the next week, Ava worked alongside Dylan, Halstead, and Medina to piece together the gang's plans. They used wiretaps, intercepted messages, and undercover observations to gather information. They learned that Rex's group was planning an attack on a community center. The goal wasn't just destruction, it was to send a message, to spread fear and division. "This is their playbook," Ava said during a late-night meeting at the precinct. "Target vulnerable communities, make them feel isolated, and then expand their influence." Halstead frowned, clearly puzzled. "But why the community center? What's the strategic value?" Ava explained, her voice calm but intense. "It's symbolic. A community center is a place where people come together, where unity thrives. Destroying it sends a clear message: no one is safe." The team's next step was to gather concrete evidence of the planned attack. Ava suggested planting a tracker on one of the gang's vehicles. It was risky. If they were caught, it would blow their cover and possibly provoke the gang into action. "I'll do it," Ava volunteered, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I know their patterns, their routines. I can get close without being seen." Halstead hesitated, but ultimately nodded. "Be careful. We can't afford to lose you." That night, Ava waited in the shadows near the Black Iron Bar. She had studied the gang's movements for weeks and knew they parked their vehicles in a lot behind the building. When the opportunity came, she rolled silently into the lot, her wheelchair's modified motor barely making a sound. The black SUV was there, its paint gleaming under the streetlights. Under the streetlights, Ava moved with precision, attaching the tracker to the undercarriage of the truck with quick, deliberate movements. She slipped away before anyone could notice, her wheelchair's modified motor barely making a sound as she maneuvered back into the shadows. The tracker proved invaluable over the next few days. It led the team to several additional locations, including a safe house where several members of the gang were hiding. Through surveillance and intercepted communications, they uncovered the final pieces of the plan. The attack on the community center was scheduled for the following week, and the gang was planning to use explosives hidden in a delivery truck, ensuring maximum damage. Ava's voice was urgent as she relayed the information to Halstead. "We need to move now. If we wait, people will die." Halstead nodded in agreement, but his face was etched with concern. We need to be smart about this. One mistake, and they'll scatter. The task force began coordinating with other agencies, pooling resources for a simultaneous operation. The plan was ambitious: raid the warehouse, intercept the delivery truck, and arrest Rex and his inner circle, all within a matter of hours. Ava was at the center of the preparations, her military experience proving invaluable. She helped map out logistics, identify potential risks, and ensure that every officer knew their role. As the day of the operation approached, Ava felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. This was it, the culmination of weeks of work. Failure wasn't an option. The moment the raid began, chaos erupted inside the warehouse. Flashbangs exploded near the entrances, their blinding light and deafening noise sending gang members scattering in every direction. Officers flooded in, shouting commands as they secured crates filled with weapons and explosives. Ava positioned herself near the rear of the building, moving with purpose, her eyes scanning the frenzied scene for Rex. In the chaos, Rex remained calm. He barked orders at his men, directing them to defend key positions while he slipped through a side door. Ava caught a glimpse of him disappearing into the shadows, and immediately gave chase. Her wheelchair's motor hummed softly as she maneuvered around crates and debris. "Rex is on the move!" Ava shouted into her comms, her voice sharp and focused. Halstead and Medina moved to intercept, but Rex was fast. He knew the layout of the warehouse better than anyone, weaving through narrow corridors, knocking over obstacles to slow his pursuers. Ava wasn't deterred. Her wheelchair's reinforced wheels handled the uneven terrain with ease, and her sharp instincts guided her as she tracked Rex's movements. He bolted out the side exit, sprinting toward a waiting black SUV. "Stop him!" Halstead yelled, as he and Medina emerged behind her. But Rex reached the vehicle first. The SUV roared to life, its tires screeching as it peeled away from the scene. Ava pushed herself harder, her wheelchair moving at top speed as she raced after it. The vehicle swerved onto the main road, disappearing into the night. Ava didn't waste a second. She relayed the vehicle description and license plate to Dylan, who immediately began tracking it through traffic cameras. "I've got eyes on the SUV," Dylan said over the comms. "They're heading east toward the industrial district." Ava clenched her fists, her focus unbroken. "Keep me updated. We're not letting him get away." Halstead called in additional units, their sirens wailing as they joined the pursuit. Ava and her team followed in an unmarked vehicle, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they sped toward the industrial district. The area was a labyrinth of warehouses, shipping yards, and narrow alleyways. Rex's driver weaved through the maze with precision, using tight corners and cluttered streets to evade the pursuing officers. Ava's vehicle stayed close, but the SUV was faster and more maneuverable. Dylan's voice crackled over the comms. "They're heading toward the old steel mill. It's a dead end, if we can box them in." Halstead nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "We'll force them into a corner." As they approached the mill, Rex's driver made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. The SUV's tires kicked up a cloud of dust as it sped ahead. Ava's team followed the vehicle, bouncing over the uneven terrain. "They're trying to lose us in the woods," Medina said, her voice tense. "We need to cut them off." Ava's mind raced. "Take the next left. There's a service road that loops around." Halstead didn't hesitate. He veered onto the narrow path, the team's vehicle barreling through the trees, their headlights illuminating the dense undergrowth. The service road led them to a clearing near the steel mill's perimeter. Ava spotted the SUV ahead, its taillights glowing like red beacons in the dark. "They've stopped," Dylan reported. "Something's not right." As they drew closer, Ava realized why. The SUV had come to a halt near a large construction site, where heavy machinery and stacks of steel beams were scattered. Rex and his men were already out of the vehicle, using the equipment as cover. "Ambush!" Ava shouted, just as gunfire erupted. Bullets ricocheted off the ground and nearby vehicles, forcing Ava and her team to take cover. Halstead radioed for backup as Medina returned fire, her shots precise and controlled. "We've got them pinned down," Halstead said, his voice strained, "but they're not going quietly." Ava scanned the scene, her sharp eyes tracking Rex as he moved between the steel beams. He was heading toward the mill, using the chaos as a distraction. "I'm going after him," Ava said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ava maneuvered her wheelchair through the construction site, dodging debris and ducking behind cover as gunfire continued to erupt around her. Her focus was unshakable, her training kicking in as she tracked Rex's movements. The steel mill loomed ahead, its towering smokestacks casting long shadows over the yard. Rex slipped inside, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness. "Ava, wait!" Medina shouted from behind, but Ava was already on the move, her baton gripped tightly in one hand. Inside the mill, the air was thick with the scent of rust and oil, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the cavernous space. Ava's heart raced as she navigated the maze of steel beams and machinery, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of Rex. "Rex!" she called out, her voice cutting through the silence. Ava's focus remained unbroken as Rex's laughter echoed from somewhere above. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." His voice floated down from the shadows, dripping with derision. "But this ends here." Ava wheeled forward cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow and corner for any sign of his next move. She spotted movement on an overhead catwalk and instinctively shifted her focus upward. There, standing with a gun trained on her, was Rex. His eyes gleamed with malice. "You're out of your depth," he sneered, his grip tightening around the weapon. "This isn't some street brawl, and you're not a hero." Ava smirked, unfazed by his words. "You're right. I'm worse." She reached for a control panel nearby and activated the mill's conveyor system. The sudden noise and movement startled Rex, giving Ava the opening she needed. As he hesitated, trying to regain his footing, Ava maneuvered quickly, taking cover behind a large piece of machinery. Rex climbed down from the catwalk, his gun still in hand, eyes searching for her position. Ava's breath remained steady, her mind calculating her next move. "You've caused me a lot of trouble." Rex's voice echoed through the space as he stepped into view. "But it's over now. You're alone, and no one's coming to save you." Ava met his gaze, unflinching, her confidence radiating. "I don't need saving." Before Rex could react, Ava launched herself forward. Using her wheelchair's reinforced frame, she rammed into him with full force. The impact knocked the gun from his hand, and the two grappled in the confined space. Rex was strong, taller than Ava, but her training gave her the edge. She twisted his arm, forcing him to the ground. He retaliated with a brutal kick that sent her chair skidding backward, but Ava regained her balance quickly. Rex scrambled to his feet, grabbing a nearby steel pipe as a makeshift weapon. He swung it at Ava, but she blocked it with her baton. The clash of metal rang through the mill, the force of their struggle creating an electric tension in the air. Each blow exchanged was calculated and fierce, Ava striking across his ribs, but Rex quickly retaliated with a sharp jab that knocked the baton from her hand. Ava's grip tightened around the edge of her chair, preparing for the next round. Realizing he was losing ground, Rex made a desperate move. He bolted toward an emergency exit, his breathing ragged as he pushed through the heavy door and disappeared into the night. Ava hesitated for only a moment before giving chase, her wheelchair's motor humming as she navigated the narrow corridors of the mill's yard. The sprawling maze of equipment and storage containers outside made it difficult to track his movements, but Ava's sharp eyes never lost their focus. She pushed herself harder, the sound of lapping water growing louder as she neared the docks. Dylan's voice came through her earpiece. "He's heading for the docks. If he gets to a boat, we'll lose him." Ava gritted her teeth. "Not if I can help it." The docks were just ahead, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the water. Rex was already there, climbing into a small motorboat. He started the engine, the boat lurching forward as he steered toward open water. Ava didn't waste a second. She spotted a nearby patrol boat and signaled to the officers on board. "We need to move, now." The officers helped her onto the boat, and they sped after Rex, the powerful engine cutting through the waves. Ava gripped the edge of the vessel, her eyes locked on Rex's boat as it weaved through the dark water. "He's heading for the marina," Dylan said, his voice crackling through the comms. "It's a dead end. but he might have backup waiting. Ava's jaw tightened. Then we cut him off before he gets there. The chase continued, the boats racing through the water, the city lights shimmering in the distance. Ava knew this was her last chance to bring Rex in, and she wasn't about to let him slip away again. The patrol boat sliced through the water, its engine roaring as Ava and the officers closed the distance between them and Rex's motorboat. The salty spray stung her face, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked on Rex, who was maneuvering toward the shadowy outlines of the marina. As the marina came into view, Ava's instincts sharpened. The rows of abandoned docks, lined with rotting wood and decrepit vessels, offered Rex plenty of hiding spots. The faint glow of city lights illuminated the marina just enough to see Rex's boat skidding to a stop near an old pier. He jumped onto the dock, his figure disappearing into the maze of boats and crates. "Cut the engine!" Ava barked at the officer piloting the patrol boat. "We'll follow on foot." The officers secured the boat, and Ava maneuvered onto the dock. Her reinforced wheelchair hummed quietly as she rolled forward, Halstead and Medina flanking her, their weapons drawn and eyes scanning for movement. "He's here somewhere," Halstead muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ava nodded, her gaze scanning every corner. "He won't go far. This place is a dead end. He's either waiting for backup or trying to find a way out." The team moved cautiously through the marina, the creaking of wooden planks beneath their feet, blending with the gentle lapping of water against the boats. Ava's sharp eyes continued to scan every shadow, her baton gripped tightly in her hand. Rex was cornered, and she knew desperation would make him even more dangerous. Suddenly, a noise, a splash, caught Ava's attention. She turned sharply, her wheelchair's motor whining softly as she adjusted her position. The sound came from a narrow alley between two rows of docked boats. "Cover me," she whispered to Halstead, who nodded and took position behind a nearby crate. Ava rolled forward, her baton raised, her eyes scanning the alley. It was dark, the faint smell of diesel and seawater hanging in the air. She spotted movement ahead, a glint of light reflecting off metal. "Rex!" she called out, her voice calm but firm. "There's nowhere left to run. Come out now, and we'll make this easier for everyone." A low chuckle echoed from the shadows. "Easier for you, maybe, but not for me." Before Ava could react, Rex lunged from the darkness, wielding a length of rusted pipe. He swung it toward her head, but Ava ducked, the pipe narrowly missing as it smashed into the side of a boat. The impact reverberated through the marina, sending a flock of gulls screeching into the night sky. Rex pressed the attack, his swings wild but powerful. Ava dodged each blow, using her agility and quick thinking to stay one step ahead. She knew this was it, the final confrontation. She wasn't going to let him escape again. Ava tightened her grip on the baton, her mind racing with the new lead. The clock was ticking, and she needed to move faster than ever. Her team had been one step behind Rex for too long, and she couldn't afford any more mistakes. "Let's move quickly," Ava said, her voice steady, her focus unshaken by the urgency of the moment. "If Rex is meeting with Orlov's people tonight, we can't waste any more time. We hit them hard and fast. No more chasing." Halstead nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "We've got a small window. If we act now, we can catch him off guard." Medina tapped her tablet, zooming in on the map. "We've traced the boat to a private slip on the east side. We think they're using it to transport goods. We might have our chance to intercept." "Good," Ava replied, her mind working through the logistics. "I want every officer ready for a raid. We'll hit the dock first, then move in on Orlov's location. We cut them off before they can regroup." Dylan chimed in, his fingers flying across his laptop. "I've intercepted more of their encrypted communications. They're planning something big. Something involving a high-profile target. I'm still piecing it together, but I'm sure it's coming up soon." "Then we don't wait," Ava said, her voice firm. "We need to act now, before they can execute whatever plan they've got." The team spent the next few hours preparing for the operation, ensuring that every officer knew their role. Ava's experience guided their strategy, making sure that everyone was in place and ready for action. This was going to be their final shot at stopping Rex and Orlov's network once and for all. The tension in the air was palpable as they approached the private slip where the boat was docked. Ava's wheelchair hummed quietly as they navigated through narrow alleyways, approaching the docks with military precision. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of movement. "This is it," Halstead said quietly, his voice low over the comms. "We hit them hard. Take them by surprise. They won't know what hit them." Ava nodded, feeling the adrenaline surge through her. It wasn't just about stopping Rex anymore. It was about dismantling everything he represented, the network of hate, fear, and destruction he had built. This was her chance to put an end to it all. The team split into two units, one moving to secure the boat, the other ready to intercept any movement from Orlov's associates. As they crept closer to the private slip, Ava's heart raced, her senses heightened. She could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of everything they had worked toward. Suddenly, gunfire rang out from the boat. A burst of light illuminated the dark water as the sound of shouts echoed through the night. Rex's people had anticipated the move, but they hadn't expected the speed and precision of the task force. "Go! Go! Go!" Ava shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She wheeled herself forward, her team close behind her. The sounds of officers rushing into position filled the air as they secured the area around the boat. Ava was in motion, her eyes locked on the task at hand. She spotted Rex trying to flee toward the water, his figure silhouetted against the dim light of the marina. Without hesitation, Ava pursued him, her wheelchair moving with surprising speed. Rex glanced over his shoulder, his eyes filled with defiance. "You think you've won?" Rex shouted, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "You have no idea what's coming." Ava smirked, her resolve unbroken. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing." With a swift movement, she feigned a left turn before spinning her chair to the right. The sudden shift caught Rex off guard, and her baton struck his wrist with precision, sending the pipe clattering to the ground. Rex stumbled back, clutching his arm, but he quickly recovered, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You have no idea what's coming." Before Ava could respond, a sharp whistle pierced the air from the shadows. Two more figures emerged, Rex's backup. Both men were armed, one with a crowbar and the other with a knife. They flanked Ava, their predatory grins gleaming in the dim light. "Looks like the odds just shifted," Rex sneered, stepping back to let his men advance. Ava tightened her grip on her baton, her mind racing. Halstead and Medina were nearby, but the confined space made it impossible for them to take a clear shot without hitting her. "3 against 1, Ava said, her tone mocking. "You must be getting desperate." The man with the crowbar lunged first, swinging downward with brute force. Ava blocked the strike with her baton, the impact sending a jolt through her arm. She twisted her chair sharply, slamming into his shin and knocking him off balance. He fell with a yelp, his weapon clattering to the ground. The second man, armed with the knife, moved in swiftly. He slashed at Ava, the blade grazing her shoulder but failing to penetrate her reinforced jacket. Ava countered with a swift strike to his wrist, forcing him to drop the knife. Halstead and Medina chose that moment to act. Halstead fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing through the marina. "Drop your weapons and step away." The two men hesitated, their confidence wavering, but Rex remained defiant. With a growl, he grabbed the crowbar from the ground and swung it wildly, forcing Halstead and Medina to take cover amid the chaos. In the midst of the commotion, Rex spotted an opportunity. He bolted toward one of the smaller boats moored nearby, its engine already running. Ava cursed under her breath. "He's getting away!" she shouted, wheeling forward. Halstead fired at the boat's engine, but the shot missed, ricocheting off the metal hull. The boat lurched forward, its motor roaring as Rex steered it toward open water. Ava turned to Dylan, her voice urgent. "Track him! We need his location." "I'm on it," Dylan replied, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "He can't outrun the satellite feeds." Back at the precinct, the mood was grim despite their efforts. Rex had slipped through their fingers once again. Ava sat at her desk, her baton resting across her lap, as she replayed the events in her mind. "This isn't working," she muttered, frustration evident in her tone. "He's always one step ahead." Halstead leaned against the desk, his expression tired but determined. We're closing the net. Every time he runs, he leaves a trail. Sooner or later, he'll make a mistake. Medina joined them, holding a tablet. Dylan's tracking his movements. The boat he took is heading toward the docks on the east side of the city. We think he's regrouping with Orlov's men. Ava nodded, her mind already formulating a plan. We need to hit him where it hurts. Take out his resources, cut off his escape routes, and force him into a corner where he has no choice but to surrender. Halstead hesitated, his brow furrowing. That's a tall order. He's got connections? Safe houses? We find them, Ava interrupted. We dismantle his network piece by piece until there's nowhere left for him to hide. People, that's our chance to catch him and dismantle this network, Ava said, her voice cutting through the tension. But we'll need to play this smart. The team had decided on a bold strategy, an elaborate sting operation designed to catch Rex in the act. Dylan, ever the tech wizard, hacked into the city's traffic and marina cameras, tracking Rex's movements in real time. Meanwhile, Ava coordinated with Halstead and Medina to deploy undercover officers at the docks, making sure every detail of the operation was flawless. By nightfall, the team was in position. Ava, wearing a concealed earpiece, waited in a discreet surveillance van parked near the docks. Her wheelchair was equipped with enhanced mobility features, ready for action. Her focus was absolute. Target sighted, Dylan's voice crackled through the earpiece. Rex just arrived. He's heading to Dock 14. Halstead responded immediately, his voice sharp. All units, stay sharp. No one moves until Ava gives the signal. Through the surveillance feed, Ava watched Rex step out of a black SUV, flanked by two heavily armed men. His face was calm, but his eyes darted around, scanning the area for any potential threats. He approached a small group of men unloading crates from a cargo ship. "That's Soft's crew," Medina whispered, her voice full of tension. "This is it." Ava's eyes narrowed as she watched Rex begin speaking to the men, gesturing toward the crates. One of the men handed Rex a tablet, which he examined briefly before nodding. This was the proof they needed. "Rex and Orlov's crew are working together now," Ava said into the comms, her voice low and steady. Halstead and Medina led a team of officers, moving in quickly but silently to surround the group. The air was electric with tension as the officers stepped into the light, weapons drawn. "Police! Hands in the air!" Halstead shouted, his voice booming across the docks. Panic erupted. Orlov's men reached for their weapons, but the officers were faster, disarming them with precise, non-lethal strikes. Rex, however, didn't panic. He shoved the tablet into a crate and bolted toward a maze of shipping containers. "Rex is running!" Ava shouted, already wheeling herself out of the van, her heart racing with determination. The docks were a labyrinth of towering crates, narrow walkways, and dimly lit paths. Ava's wheelchair moved with practiced precision as she followed Rex's trail. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the metal surfaces of the dock, but she was gaining on him. "You can't run forever, Rex," she called out, her voice unwavering. He didn't respond, disappearing around a corner. Ava pushed herself harder, her wheelchair's motor humming as she navigated the uneven terrain ahead. She caught a glimpse of him climbing onto a stack of crates. "I've got him in sight," Ava reported through her earpiece, her pulse quickening. "He's trying to get to higher ground." Halstead and Medina split up to cut off Rex's escape routes, but Rex was relentless, leaping from crate to crate with the agility of a predator. Ava knew she couldn't match his physical speed, but she didn't need to. Her mind worked faster than any physical pursuit. Nearby, Ava spotted a crane operator's control panel. An idea sparked in her mind, and she wheeled toward it, her focus laser sharp. "Dylan, I need access to the crane controls." "I've got it," Dylan responded. "Give me 30 seconds." As Rex climbed higher, Ava moved with urgency. She activated the crane, maneuvering a large container into Rex's path. He stumbled, barely catching himself on the edge of a crate. "Give it up, Rex!" Ava shouted, her voice carrying across the space. "You're out of options." Rex glared down at her, his face twisted with rage. "You think this ends here? You have no idea what's coming." With the crane cutting off his escape, Rex climbed down, landing in a narrow alley between two stacks of containers. Ava moved to block the exit, baton at the ready. "It's over, Rex," she said, her voice steady. "Surrender now, and maybe you'll live long enough to see a courtroom." Rex sneered, his face contorted with defiance. "You think you've won? I'm just a piece of the puzzle. Take me out, and someone worse will take my place." Ava didn't flinch. "Then I'll take them down too, one by one." Rex lunged toward her, but Ava was ready. She swung her baton, catching him across the arm. He grunted in pain, but kept coming, throwing a wild punch that glanced off her shoulder. Ava countered with a swift strike to his knee, forcing him to the ground. Before Rex could recover, Halstead and Medina arrived, pinning him down and cuffing his hands behind his back. "It's over," Halstead said, his voice firm and resolute. The tension in the precinct's operations room was thick as Ava, Halstead, and Medina sifted through the trove of evidence recovered from Rex's tablet and the intercepted crates. The walls were lined with boards covered in photographs, maps, and documents, all connected by a web of strings. It painted a grim picture of Rex's network and its far-reaching influence. Dylan sat at his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he decrypted the last remaining files on Rex's tablet. "Got it!" Dylan exclaimed, his voice cutting through the silence. He turned the screen toward the group. "Blueprints, detailed plans, and even schedules. This isn't just a gang," Ava said, her voice cold as she scanned the documents. "It's an organized syndicate. They were planning coordinated attacks on multiple targets, including community centers, schools, synagogues, and cultural hubs, all places where unity and diversity thrived, places marked for destruction. These aren't random acts of violence," Ava said, her voice unwavering. "This is terrorism." Medina pointed to one document on the screen. "Look at this financial trail. Wire transfers from offshore accounts, all routed through shell companies tied to Orlov. This proves he's bankrolling the entire operation." Halstead folded his arms, his jaw tight with anger. "This isn't just about Rex anymore. Orlov is the mastermind. We need to take this evidence to federal authorities." Ava shook her head, her mind already working through the next steps. "Not yet. If we move too soon, Orlov will slip away like smoke. We need to dismantle the network from the ground up. Take out every piece until he has nowhere to hide." The air was electric with tension as Orlov's name hung in the room. The team knew what they had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. Violence. Their reign of terror was coming to an end. The precinct hummed with quiet triumph as Ava stood, watching Orlov being escorted through the corridors. His shoulders were slumped, his once imposing posture now diminished, a stark contrast to the figure that had masterminded so much destruction. Ava's eyes narrowed as she watched him. This was not just the culmination of years of work, but also a moment of reckoning for a network that had wreaked havoc across the region. "You did good," Halstead said, his voice low, standing beside her. Ava didn't respond immediately, her mind still running through every detail of the operation. She was relieved, but her thoughts were already turning toward what came next. "Not yet," she said quietly. "This is just one piece. The rest of the network's still out there." Medina, who had been reviewing data on her tablet, looked up. "We've got their entire network of safe houses, offshore accounts, everything. Orlov's empire is bigger than we thought." Ava nodded. "That's why we can't stop now." Dylan entered the room, his eyes alight with the fire of victory. "I've run through the satellite data, intercepted messages, and all of the encrypted communications. We have everything we need to put the rest of them down. Every name, every location." Orlov was just the tip of the iceberg. Ava turned to him, her gaze sharp. "What are we looking at?" Dylan leaned over the desk, pulling up a map on the large screen. "Safe houses in multiple countries, extensive financial transactions, arms deals. This goes global. It's a massive organization tied to criminal syndicates and, possibly, even state-sponsored terrorism." Medina's voice held a note of disbelief. "So, Orlov was working with international players?" "Not just working with," Dylan replied, pointing at the map. "He was organizing, funding, and coordinating multiple arms trafficking rings and terror operations. It's far-reaching." Ava's thoughts went to the families, communities, and innocent lives impacted by the violence orchestrated by Orlov's network. The road to justice wasn't over. It had just taken a new turn. We take this down piece by piece, and we make sure no one is left to pick up where Orlov left off. The operation's success was bittersweet. Ava had achieved what so many before her had failed to do: bring Orlov, the mastermind, to justice. But with him in custody, the enormity of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about dismantling a hate-driven network. It was about stopping a global crisis, one that was far from over. As they processed the final pieces of evidence, the phone rang, pulling the team's attention to the case's next chapter. Halstead picked it up, listening intently. His face tightened as the call ended. "They're on the move," he said grimly. "Orlov's associates are already planning their next steps. We've got less than 24 hours before they start to regroup and reorganize." Ava's eyes hardened with resolve. "Then we don't wait. We hit them now. We finish this before they can rebuild." The task force mobilized immediately. The team split into specialized units to target the remaining members of Orlov's network. With the mastermind finally captured, the operation became a race against time. Ava led the charge, her expertise and calm demeanor guiding the team as they prepared for a wave of raids across multiple locations. "This is it," Ava said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "We clean house." The raid teams, coordinated with precision, moved to secure locations tied to Orlov's associates. Each one had a part to play in the larger picture of dismantling the global operation. Officers moved with deadly intent, securing key locations, finding weapons caches, and arresting high-level players in the network. The coordinated effort was methodical, swift, and brutal. There was no room for mistakes. Ava's wheelchair moved silently through each location as she kept track of each operation's progress, watching through live feeds and giving direct orders. Her mind was focused on every detail. Her training had prepared her for this exact moment, to lead with strategy and take down the remaining pieces of a sprawling empire of terror. As the last of Orlov's men were rounded up, the weight of their success settled over the precinct. They had taken down a network that spanned continents, obliterated multiple arms trafficking operations, and exposed a vast international criminal conspiracy. Ava stood in the operations room, watching as the final raid was completed. The monitors in front of her flashed with reports of arrests, evidence seized, and arms caches destroyed. It was a victory, but the toll had been high. For every success, there were the stories of the lives lost, the pain caused by Orlov's actions. "This is just the beginning," Ava said, her voice firm. "We've dismantled Orlov's operation, but there are still more like him out there." This network was only the first domino. Halstead, standing beside her, nodded. "You've done it, Ava. You've stopped a global threat." Ava's gaze hardened. "I didn't stop anything. This fight isn't over. We've made a dent, but there's more work to do." With Orlov and his network dismantled, Ava knew that her fight against hatred and violence would never truly end. There would always be another mastermind to take down, another network to destroy. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had made a difference. She had taken down one of the most dangerous men in the world. Records, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies. The prosecution painted a damning picture of a network built on hate, violence, and fear. Each piece of evidence added weight to the argument that Viktor Orlov and Rex were not just players in isolated crimes, but leaders of an organized, terror-fueled campaign. Every document, every tape, and every photo was meticulously connected to show how their operations spanned continents, funded by legitimate businesses, masked as simple protection rackets, and designed to destabilize communities. The courtroom, a sea of intensity and emotion, was a stark contrast to the calculated calm of Orlov. Sitting with his hands folded in front of him, maintaining the air of control he had once wielded with such power. His face was unreadable, but Ava could feel the fury bubbling underneath. He knew the stakes were high, and with each passing hour, his chances of escaping the full weight of the law were slipping away. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this was her moment to make a difference. She had stood in the shadows for too long, watching hate groups operate unchecked. But now, here, in this very room, she had a front-row seat to the justice that would unfold, and she knew that it was her testimony, her experience, that could make all the difference. As the trial moved forward, Ava felt the pressure build with each piece of evidence presented. She had seen the worst of the gang's actions, their intimidation, their manipulation, and the pain they inflicted on the community. She had witnessed their attempts to break her, to force her into submission, but through all of it, she had stood firm, determined not to let them win. Now, standing on the precipice of something bigger than herself, she knew she had to finish what she had started. It wasn't just about convicting Orlov and Rex. It was about sending a message that their twisted ideology wouldn't take root in the world she wanted to protect. Throughout the trial, Orlov's defense team used every trick in the book to discredit the evidence. They attacked the validity of witness testimonies, questioned the reliability of the financial records, and attempted to spin the narrative of Rex and Orlov as victims of societal problems. But Samantha Willis, the lead prosecutor, was unflinching. She methodically countered every accusation, dismantling the defense's arguments with precision. Ava remained a silent but constant presence in the gallery, watching, waiting. Her turn was coming, and she would be ready. She had lived through the terror that Orlov and Rex had unleashed. She had seen firsthand how far their influence stretched, how their hate seeped into the fabric of the community. It wasn't just about the violence they caused, it was about the message they sent, a message that said some people didn't belong, that they were less than others. But Ava knew the truth. Everyone belonged. And the court was about to show the world that hate had no place in a society built on unity and justice. The day arrived when Ava was called to the witness stand. Her heart beat faster as she wheeled herself toward the front of the courtroom. This was her moment to confront Orlov, to expose the depth of his crimes, and to make sure that no one would ever forget what he had done. She raised her head, her eyes locked on the defense table, where Orlov sat with his calculating gaze. Rex was seated beside him, his face twisted in an expression of defiance. "Ms. James," the prosecutor began, her voice steady but filled with urgency, "could you tell the court about your experience with Orlov's network?" Ava took a deep breath and began her testimony. She spoke calmly, but every word was loaded with the weight of her experiences. She described how she had been targeted by Orlov's men, how they had attempted to silence her with fear and intimidation, and how Rex had been one of the enforcers of Orlov's twisted ideology. She didn't flinch as she recounted the specific events of the attack on her, how she had fought back and stood firm against those who thought they could break her. "I faced their hate," she said, her voice unwavering. "But what I want the world to understand is that I wasn't alone. There are communities, families, who are still suffering because of what they did, and now it's time for them to face justice." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension of the room. Orlov's eyes narrowed as she spoke, but he made no move to interrupt. Ava knew that this was the moment of truth. The defense would try to discredit her, to paint her as biased, but she had the truth on her side, and the jury knew it. Throughout her testimony, Ava remained calm, composed. She wasn't just a victim. She was the embodiment of the resilience that refused to let hate define the world. The prosecutor, Samantha Willis, asked her to go into more detail about the gang's operations, the terror they had inflicted, and the specific ways Orlov had financed and organized their violence. Ava recounted how Rex had reported directly to Orlov, how he had been an extension of his will, carrying out the atrocities planned by the mastermind. Orlov's defense team tried to derail her testimony, asking leading questions meant to confuse and discredit her. But Ava didn't waver. She stood strong in her resolve. She was there to make sure that Orlov and Rex couldn't hide behind their lies. At the end of her testimony, Ava felt the weight of her words linger in the courtroom. She had done her part, and now the jury had everything they needed to make their decision. Orlov and Rex's fate was no longer in their hands. It was in the hands of justice. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the jury deliberated. Ava, Halstead, Medina, and the rest of the team stood together, waiting for the final verdict. Outside the courthouse, the protests and support for the victims continued to build. People were finally speaking up, demanding accountability for the terror that had spread through their communities. The hours dragged on as the jury deliberated, but when the decision came, it was swift and decisive. Orlov and Rex were found guilty on all counts. The verdict was a moment of closure, not just for Ava, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of their operation. Justice had prevailed. But Ava knew the work was far from done. As long as hate existed, there would be more battles to fight, more victories to claim. But tonight, they had won. And for Ava, that was enough. For now, Ava, standing at the forefront of the rebuilding efforts, became not just a symbol of resilience, but a catalyst for change. The community center that had once been torn apart by Rex's gang was now rising from the ashes. The volunteers who gathered there from all walks of life worked side by side to restore not only the physical structure, but also the spirit of the community it had once represented. The sound of hammering and laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the violence that had once gripped the area. As Ava stood in the middle of the rebuilding process, watching the volunteers work, she reflected on how far they had come. This wasn't just about repairing a building. It was about rebuilding trust, unity, and hope in a place that had been scarred by years of hate and terror. It was a powerful statement to those who had tried to destroy the heart of their community that they would not succeed, and that the light of compassion and solidarity would always outshine the darkness they had tried to cast. Meanwhile, the victory in court had sent shockwaves through the nation. News outlets, both local and national, covered the story extensively. The headlines hailed Ava's courage, the conviction of Orlov and Rex, and the broader victory in the fight against domestic terrorism. But Ava knew that this was just the beginning. There were still many battles to fight, and there were still networks of hate that needed to be dismantled. Her journey wasn't over. It had only shifted to a new phase. But the victory was not without its toll. Ava's physical and emotional scars ran deep. The memories of the attacks, the ambush in the alley, the raid on the compound, and the rooftop confrontation with Orlov, all of it played back in her mind like a relentless film reel. Yet, with each passing day, as the community center was rebuilt and hope slowly returned to the area, Ava felt the weight of her past slowly lifting. This was the true cost of victory, the ability to heal, to rebuild, and to ensure that the past would never repeat itself. In the weeks following the trial, Ava remained in close contact with survivors, continuing to advocate for those who had been left behind by the justice system. She worked with community leaders, law enforcement, and grassroots organizations to help them prepare for the next wave of challenges. Her influence, once limited to a small community, had expanded into a nationwide movement, one dedicated to confronting hate head-on, to rooting out violence wherever it festered, and to rebuilding the social fabric that had been torn apart by Orlov's influence. Ava's name became synonymous with resilience and justice, but it was never about the recognition. It was about what she could do for the communities affected, about standing up for those who had no voice, and about making sure the horrors inflicted by Orlov and his associates were never forgotten. The fight to rebuild the community center, though a symbol of success, was still a long journey. The work didn't stop when the building was restored. Ava, along with other activists and community leaders, continued to organize programs, workshops, and outreach efforts aimed at bringing people together. These weren't just about rebuilding structures, they were about healing hearts, breaking down the walls of fear, and ensuring that the next generation would grow up in a world that valued unity and acceptance. As the community center finally opened its doors once more, Ava stood before a crowd of local residents, survivors, and volunteers. The once shattered building now stood tall, a symbol of their collective strength and determination. Ava smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. They had won this battle, and as she looked out at the faces before her, she knew that they had won something even more important: their future. Today, she said to the crowd, her voice strong and filled with hope. We don't just celebrate the rebuilding of a building. We celebrate the rebuilding of a community, the renewal of our faith in each other, and the beginning of a future where hate has no place. As the crowd cheered, Ava knew that there would always be more to fight for, more to rebuild, and more to protect. But she also knew that every step forward, no matter how difficult, was a victory in itself. The war wasn't over, but they were on the right path. The battle had been fought, the victory was won, and now, together, they would continue to forge a future free from hate. Ava's tireless efforts in the aftermath of the trial became a beacon of hope and inspiration for countless communities. She didn't just oversee the rebuilding of the community center. She joined in, becoming a hands-on leader in every sense. From organizing fundraisers to speaking at community events, Ava's wheelchair, once a target of ridicule by Rex and his men, now stood as a symbol of unwavering strength. She had become not just a survivor, but a leader, showing others that true power came from unity and resilience. The first vigil held at the newly rebuilt center marked a defining moment. Hundreds gathered, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of candlelight. The survivors shared their stories, their voices steady but filled with emotion. One woman, holding her young daughter, tearfully spoke of the attempt to tear them apart. "They tried to break us," she said, "but we are unbreakable." Ava, feeling the weight of their shared struggle, wheeled to the makeshift podium. As the crowd fell silent, her voice rang out, strong and confident. "This building," she began, "is more than brick and mortar. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we stand together. Rex and Orlov wanted to divide us, to make us afraid, but look around. Fear didn't win. Hate didn't win. Unity did." The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of affirmation that rolled through the crowd. Among them stood Marcus, the young man who had first alerted Ava to the gang's activities. He approached her after the vigil, his face lit with admiration. "You did it," he said simply. "You brought them to justice." Ava smiled, shaking her head. "We did it," she corrected, gesturing to the crowd. "Every person here played a part, and it's not over. The fight continues." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "It's a start, though." The trial's outcome sent shockwaves across the nation. Politicians, activists, and leaders seized the moment to push for systemic change. News outlets covered the verdict extensively, framing it as a turning point in the fight against domestic terrorism. In Congress, new legislation aimed at combating hate crimes more effectively was introduced. The Community Resilience Act proposed increased funding for education programs, hate crime investigations, and victim support services. It also called for stricter penalties for those who incited violence. Ava was invited to testify before a congressional committee on the importance of these measures. She sat at the long table facing rows of lawmakers and cameras. Her presence was commanding, a reminder of the real-world impact of the legislation. "We cannot wait for tragedy to strike before we act," Ava said, her voice steady. The signs were there: graffiti, threats, small acts of violence that escalated into terrorism. If we address hate at its roots, we can prevent it from growing into something catastrophic. Her testimony was met with bipartisan applause, and the bill gained momentum. Ava's role in the fight against hate grew beyond her city as she became a national advocate. She traveled to communities affected by similar violence, sharing her story and offering support. But despite the victories, Ava knew the battle was far from over. Orlov's network was vast, and dismantling it would require relentless effort. Law enforcement continued to raid safe houses and intercept shipments, but remnants of the organization adapted, scattering and operating more covertly. One evening, Ava received a call from Halstead. His tone was grim. "We've picked up chatter about a splinter group. They're planning something." Ava's heart sank. "What do we know?" "Not much yet," Halstead admitted. "But they're angry. They see Orlov and Rex as martyrs. We're tracking leads, but we could use your insight." Ava spent sleepless nights poring over intelligence, identifying patterns and potential targets. The threat of retaliation loomed large, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. Instead, she worked to empower others, training community leaders in recognizing and countering hate. She knew that the fight required more than just stopping individuals. It required shifting the cultural mindset, teaching communities to stand strong and united against any form of hate. In the midst of her activism, Ava didn't forget the individuals whose lives had been upended by Rex and Orlov. She visited survivors regularly, offering support and listening to their stories. One day, she met with an elderly man whose church had been targeted. He showed her a photo of the congregation gathered before the attack, their faces filled with joy. "They tried to take this from us," he said, his voice trembling. "But we rebuilt, and we'll keep rebuilding." Ava nodded, moved by his resilience. "You're an inspiration," she said. "Your strength shows them. They can't win." Not all encounters were uplifting. Some survivors struggled with trauma, wounds both visible and invisible. Ava worked closely with mental health professionals to ensure they received the care they needed. She often reminded them that healing takes time, but you're not alone. As months turned into years, the impact of Ava's work became evident. Hate groups were no longer operating with impunity. Communities were better equipped to stand against them. Schools implemented programs teaching tolerance and empathy, and local governments invested in fostering inclusivity. The community center, fully rebuilt and thriving, became a beacon of hope. Its walls were adorned with murals celebrating unity, painted by local artists and children. Ava often visited, her presence a reminder of what they had overcome. One day, a ceremony was held where a plaque was unveiled in her honor. It read, "In recognition of Ava James, whose courage and determination reminded us that justice is not passive, it is pursued." Standing beside Marcus, now a leader in his own right, Ava felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "This isn't about me," she said quietly. "It's about all of us." Ava's work didn't end with Orlov and Rex's downfall. She founded an organization dedicated to combating hate and supporting survivors through workshops, advocacy, and community-building initiatives. She continued to fight for a world where justice prevailed, and where every person, regardless of their background, could live without fear of hatred or violence. As she wheeled through the bustling streets of her city, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle against hate was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain. As long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, justice would prevail.